Hi everyone, this video is going to go over the poem explication assignment and the resources for the assignment on Blackboard. So on the Blackboard course site, I've added this category, Poem Explication Guidelines and Resources, and that's where you'll find the assignment itself. So let's start at the beginning. The basic requirements for this are that it needs to be formatted according to MLA style, so 12-point Times New Roman font, double-spaced, and 1-inch margins, and we are using MLA format for the heading and page numbering, as well as the in-text citations and the works cited page. So if you need a refresher on any of those guidelines, you can go to Blackboard under the Reading and Writing resources, and those include more general resources, including the MLA guidelines on doing in-text citations for poetry, and works cited entries, as well as the general format for formatting an essay document following MLA guidelines. Back to the poem assignment, the length requirement is 500 to 750 words. I would like to have you try to keep it within that length requirement. Going over is better than going under, but I don't want you to go more than about 100 words over, just to practice being concise in your writing. And a poem explication is just an analysis of an individual poem. So you can choose which poem you want to analyze. You can choose any poem from our textbook, the Norton Anthology of Poetry. It just needs to be a poem that we haven't already discussed in class, so that your analysis will be based on your own ideas and interpretations, not on things that we've already talked about for another poem in class. Or you may choose to analyze any poem that is a part of one of those 4 poetry collections by 4 individual authors that are listed on the first page of the syllabus. You're not required to have acquired one of those collections yet, but you will need to choose one of those 4 collections by week 8 of the semester to write your final essay on. So if you already have one of them, you can use one of the poems from that. If you don't already have one of them, but you want to look around online and find a poem by that author and double check to see if that poem is from that specific collection, then you could use something from one of those instead of the textbook. And then the explication itself is going to include a thesis. That thesis should basically summarize your interpretation of the poem. So maybe you're going to choose, what do you think is the most compelling thing about the poem to you? Maybe it's the imagery or the tone or something else. Your thesis might, for example, focus on a central conflict within the poem. A lot of poems tell a story in the same way that a more traditional prose narrative does. So one of the resources that I've provided for you is from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and that's the focus it takes. So if we look back under the poem explication guidelines and resources, you'll see this link to poetry explications that talks about how you can organize an explication, what kinds of details you should include in it, what you could focus on, and it suggests that you think about, this list of questions, the who, what, when, where, and why questions as they might apply to a poem more specifically, and try to answer those in your explication. And then it's also reminding you to focus on the details of how the poem goes about answering those questions using form and rhetoric and syntax and vocabulary. And it also goes into some more detail about particular patterns that can be found in poetry, such as rhyme and meter, and gives you an overview on those different terms and how to determine what a poem's rhyme and meter are. And then it gives you some suggestions for how to organize the explication. You might want to, again, focus on a central conflict in the poem and describe that in your opening paragraph along with your thesis statement, and then provide the details that support that thesis from the poem throughout your essay, and then just a brief conclusion, since this is such a short assignment. It also gives you some reminders, like you're talking about the voice of the poem as the speaker instead of just the poet, as I pointed out in my comments on our first discussion forum on the poetic line. Gives you some helpful verbs that you can use instead of just, the generic form of to be, and it also gives you an example of an explication. In addition to that, I've given you 2 other examples, but we'll look at those in a minute. So back to the assignment that I've given you. Once you've decided what you want your thesis to be, what you want your focus to be, then you're going to support that thesis using quotations from the poem and analyzing how the various poetic elements within the poem contribute to your interpretation of that poem that you're making in your thesis. So you want to look at the poetic devices that the poem is using, right? And that can include, things like the form of the poem, the speaker, the tone, the line breaks, the imagery, rhyme, meter, any of the poetic devices that are used within the poem. So you should discuss the poem in the present tense. That's just academic convention. And even though it is a short essay, I do want you to include paragraph breaks and a brief introduction and a conclusion, as well as in-text citations for when you quote from the poem. You should include the line numbers from the poem as your in-text citations for quotations from the poem. And you should also have a works cited entry at the end for the poem. So for this assignment, I do not want you to include any interpretations of this poem from other people. This should just be your own thoughts and analysis and interpretation of the poem. So you may use the resources that are provided on the course Blackboard site, such as the Poetry Foundation's Glossary of Poetic Terms, or the Poem Explication Guidelines from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill that we just looked at, but your interpretation should be your own interpretation. And then there's also a grading rubric that shows how I'm going to grade the assignment. So the explication is worth 10% of your grade, but the rubric is breaking it down into, out of 100% so that you can see what your grade is for that essay. So the introduction and thesis should be there. The analysis should show that you understand the poem. It should support your thesis, and your analysis should discuss a variety of poetic elements that are used within the poem, again, such as the syntax, the meter, the rhyme, line, tone, imagery, etc. Basically, when I'm reading your analysis, it should be clear that what you're analyzing is a poem and not just a prose piece written in paragraph form, right? So you should be analyzing the things that are more unique to poetry. And then I will be looking that your essay is well organized and makes sense and is easy to follow, and that you are supporting your analysis with evidence from the poem, which means quotations from the poem. I do want you to try to make sure that no more than roughly 10% of your essay is quotations from the poem that you're analyzing, because I want most of that 500 to 750 words to be your own analysis of the poem. So the other parts of the rubric are focusing on basics, grammar, writing style, and following MLA format, as well as, meeting that 500-word minimum length requirement. So let's go ahead and take a look at the sample essays. I have a folder here under the Poem Explication Guidelines and Resources with 2 sample student essays from students who completed this assignment in a previous class. So the first sample essay is an explication of The Mill by Edwin Arlington Robinson. This is a poem that is in your textbook, so you can take a look at it there on the Works Cited page. You see it gives the page number from the textbook, so you can look it up there and read that poem first if you want to take a look at this analysis in detail as an example. What I've done here is I have highlighted in yellow the explication's thesis statement at the end of the first paragraph here, and then throughout the explication I have highlighted in yellow various poetic or literary devices that the explication is discussing, and then in green I have highlighted the direct quotations taken from the poem. So one big thing to keep in mind when you are identifying the various poetic devices that the poem uses, it's not enough to just say, here is a poetic device that is used in this poem. You then need to analyze, how is that poetic device used in the poem? What effect does that poetic device have on the meaning of the poem, or what impact does that poetic device have on someone reading the poem? So, for example, this student talks about the vocabulary that's used in the poem, and it gives some specific examples of what that vocabulary is, but it also explains what effect that vocabulary is having on the reader, right? So it's doing both of those things. So keep that in mind. And then, yeah, for the works cited, you can see that this is how you would do a works cited entry for a poem from our anthology. The author that you should use is the author of the individual poem, and then the title of the poem, then the title of the anthology and the editors of the anthology, the publication information, company and date, as well as the page number of that specific poem that you're analyzing in your explication. The second example that I gave you of an explication is for a poem that is not from our anthology. This is from a collection by the poet Ocean Vuong called Night Sky with Exit Wounds. This is a poem called Thanksgiving 2006. And this is a poetry collection that students in a previous class were able to choose to write about. So I do have the full text of that poem here at the end of this explication for you to take a look at if you want to look at this example in more detail. And I did the same thing with this. So the first sentence is the explication's thesis statement. I have highlighted the poetic devices that are mentioned throughout in yellow, and I have highlighted the direct quotations throughout in green. And notice that what's being given for the in-text citations for those quotations from the poem, these are not page numbers, these are line numbers, right? And notice that since this is quoting from two different lines of the poem, those line breaks are shown with a slash in between the lines. So keep those formatting things in mind when you're quoting from your poems. If we look at the course content, then you will see that for next week, for week 3, the rough draft of the explication is due on Monday, June 8th, and you're going to post that rough draft to this poem explication rough draft and peer review discussion forum. You need to post your rough draft by 9 a.m. on Monday, and then once you have posted your own draft, then you're allowed to choose somebody else's draft to review. So you're not allowed to review someone else's draft until you have posted your own. And once you choose someone's draft that you want to review, just choose someone's post that doesn't have any replies to it yet. Reply right away, letting other students know that you want to review that person's draft so that the same person, you know, isn't reviewing the same draft, so that we don't have multiple people reviewing the same draft. And then you have until midnight to then reply to that classmate's draft with your feedback. So your review of your classmate's draft, it should be at least 200 words long. If you just want to write up a separate paragraph of comments, you can do that, you know, discussing what you think the strengths and weaknesses are. Focus on the content and the organization, you know, how well it addresses the assignment, what you think is maybe, you know, off topic, or things you think should be included, or things that you think worked well. You may also choose to comment directly on the essay document itself. You can use the comment function in Microsoft Word, or you can just go in, you know, to within a paragraph in the essay document and do a different color of text and add your comments where they apply. So you'll submit that by midnight, and then the final draft is due on Wednesday of next week on June 10th. So I'm not going to automatically give you feedback on your rough draft from myself, but if you have any questions on the rough draft, or if you would like me to read your rough draft and give you feedback on it, I will absolutely do that. Just email me by the end of the day Monday and let me know that, and I'm happy to do that. And let me know if you have any other questions.